What I do propose to do in the 4 sessions I have with you this afternoon, this evening, and tomorrow morning is to hit some of the high points as I see them and take the opportunity to let you in on some of the thinking I've been doing on some of these matters so that I might get your own feedback. I find that I learn best in a context not necessarily of polemics, but at least a context of discussion. What I want to do in this first session is set a basic framework, as I understand it, by looking at some of the theology in Matthew's Gospel on fulfillment. Second, tonight, explore a little bit further, moving from some of Matthew's teaching to issues of the law and the Christian, particularly in Paul. Tomorrow morning, then, to turn our attention to another kind of aspect of this matter, the relationship of Old and New Testaments, and that has to do with the way the Old Testament is used by New Testament authors. And what I propose to do tomorrow morning is pay special attention to Romans 9 to 11 and some interesting quotations there. And then to wrap things up later tomorrow morning with some tentative ideas about how we can explain the validity of some of the rather strange things that Paul does with the Old Testament in Romans 9 through 11. But first, let's turn our attention this afternoon to Matthew's Gospel. Writing to a church that was apparently very unsettled about its relationship to the synagogue, trying to figure out just who they were as Christians, seeking to come up with a self-identity that would establish this fledgling messianic movement in terms of the Jewish context and the other religions of the day, it's not at all surprising that we find Matthew dealing often with the question of how we are to understand the Old Testament and the law. It is a key theme in the Gospel of Matthew, as most of you, I'm sure, know. It's a rich theme in Matthew, and so, again, we can only touch the surface of some of the points that Matthew makes. But clearly, if we begin with the term fulfill, we begin at the point which is extremely significant for Matthew himself. He uses the term far more than any of the other evangelists. It is one of the key words of his gospel. Now, the Greek word involved, as most of us know, plerao, has a simple sense of filling something up. If you go out and get a glass and put water into it, you fill it up, you plerao, as it were, that glass. You fill it up, and so the word is used in the New Testament of a fishing net, which is filled with fish, for instance. Matthew obviously is using it in a theological sense. And the sense of the word we are probably most familiar with, we might just anchor in one text among many we could choose here from Matthew chapter 1. Well-known attempt of Matthew, of course, to ground the birth of this Messiah, Jesus, in the Old Testament prophecies. Quoting, of course, in this case, Matthew 1:22 to 23, Isaiah 7:14. All this, Matthew says, took place to fulfill what the Lord had said through the prophet. The virgin will be with child and will give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel, which means God with us. Here I think we could say we have a classic case of fulfillment. Indeed, it's the way in which many people would virtually exhaust the meaning of this word fulfill. They would assume that what Matthew and others in the New Testament are talking about is a relationship between an Old Testament prophecy and its New Testament realization. God, through a prophet, foretells that something will happen in conjunction with the establishment of his salvation. That something, which is promised, happens, and we now have a fulfillment. I think that fits the scenario of this quotation. Whatever we want to do, with the original context of Isaiah, however we want to understand this promise and who the Son is in terms of whether it's the prophet's son or king of that day or purely messianic. We can leave those questions to the side and simply note that from Matthew's perspective, he is apparently viewing Isaiah as a prophecy that has now found realization in the predicted birth of Messiah. "13 times we find a similar formula in Matthew as he introduces an Old Testament quotation. But we don't read very much further in Matthew until we begin to sense that there's something more going on with this fulfillment idea than we might first have suspected. Let's stay in the infancy narrative. We turn to Matthew chapter 2. As Matthew continues to talk about the significant places involved in the birth of Jesus. That seems to be his focus in each of his quotations in chapter 2. And you remember the story, of course, of the flight to Egypt. Joseph, warned in a dream about danger, and so he takes up Mary and the child, and they flee to Egypt. Eventually, Herod dies, the king who was issuing the threat, verse 15. And they then come back. And Matthew comments, "And so was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet, 'Out of Egypt I called my son.'" Hosea 11:1. To be sure, a text in a prophet, but not a prophecy, as the past tense of our English here might suggest. No, this is Hosea commenting on Israel's past, the experience in which God, at the Exodus, called his people out of Egypt, formed them into a nation. "Out of Egypt I called my son Israel." This was historical, a past action of God. How then can Matthew claim that this historical reference finds fulfillment? We have no prophecy here, in any technical sense of the word at least. Well, what I'd suggest is that we begin to understand that for Matthew, the concept of fulfillment applies to far more than Old Testament prophecies. Fulfillment applies, Matthew, I think, ultimately is going to suggest to us, to all of the Old Testament in every one of its parts. The Old is related to the New in a scheme of promise fulfillment. Everything in the Old Testament in one way or another, Matthew, I think, suggests to us, has some kind of anticipation of Jesus Christ. He's not inviting us to indulge in unbridled allegory, as has sometimes been the case in the history of the church, trying to find Jesus in every single Old Testament verse by whatever means, however artificial and contrived. No, Matthew's perspective is broader. He is saying that there is operating within Scripture a salvation history in which God in the Old Testament prepares for the culmination of his plan in Messiah. And all of that Old Testament, in all of its parts and in various ways, anticipates the culmination of that plan that is now coming to pass. There is a recapitulation then in the life of Jesus of the life of Israel. Israel was called out of Egypt, so now Jesus, God's greater Son, is called out of Egypt. Israel is tempted for 40 years in the wilderness. Jesus is tempted for 40 days in the wilderness. Israel fails that test, looking at the obstacles rather than God's promise and faithfulness, and they are punished. Jesus, God's greater Son, passes the test. And thus we find that juxtaposed to the temptation narrative in Matthew is the voice from heaven, "This is my Son, with whom I am well pleased." The verse before the temptation narrative in Matthew. So what at first might look like a contrived or arbitrary kind of a reference, Matthew 2:15, is, when we probe a little bit more deeply, the tip of an extremely important iceberg of fulfillment. "Out of Egypt I called my son." In Jesus, that word of Hosea is filled up. It comes to have its ultimate significance. It has come to have a fuller meaning, if I might use a phrase I will explain and defend tomorrow before someone rips clothing here in front of us. But Matthew does not stop here. And the text I'd like to spend most of my time on, for reasons both of its importance in the history of interpretation, as well as because of its fundamental significance, I think, in charting the course that I want to take with us over the next few sessions, is Matthew 5. You will not be surprised that we get to this text fairly quickly when we're investigating the fulfillment theme in Matthew's Gospel. Because here in the Sermon on the Mount, surely we find the classic text on fulfillment. One, however, which from virtually the beginning of the church has been quite hotly debated as to its meaning and ultimate theological significance. And because of its importance, and because I like to stay oriented to the text, we're going to spend most of the rest of our time in this session here. I'm not going to read the entirety, partly because I suspect most of us are pretty familiar with the passage, but at least I'd like to read, as you follow with me, verses 17 to 20. We'll be dipping into the rest of chapter 5 as well, but here is clearly the foundational passage. Jesus, of course, is teaching. "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. I tell you the truth, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen, will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Anyone who breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commandments will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven." Note first that there is an assumption built into this passage. Why does Jesus put things in a negative light in verse 17? Why does he have to say to the people, "Do not think"? Only because he's well aware that they might very well be thinking just that. You see, Matthew doesn't tell us about this kind of earlier teaching of Jesus. But we can well assume as we read throughout the rest of Matthew and the other Gospels that already the teaching of Jesus had struck people as so original, as coming with such authority, such as the crowds recognized at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, that they wondered what kind of stance he was taking with respect to the Old Testament. There was something in Jesus' teaching, perhaps in his behavior as well, that was suggesting to people, here comes someone who seems to be quite independent of the Old Testament, who seems to be going his own way, without sufficiently grounding himself in God's prior revelation. This fellow must be quite a revolutionary. Maybe he's come to abolish the law and the prophets. Maybe he has come to set them aside. Maybe he's a rebel against the Jewish faith. Maybe he's somebody we need to take action against. This note of Jesus' authority, his exousia, is a theme that pervades all of our Gospels. You see it in Jesus' teaching. You see it in his exorcisms. You see it in his behavior in all kinds of ways. And it's that exousia, that authority, that has struck people and led to the necessity for Jesus to clear up a misunderstanding about himself. No, he wants to say, I have not come to abolish the law and the prophets, and don't you think that I have. Rather, I have come to fulfill them. And here, of course, we meet again this key word, fulfill. But how to understand it here? What kind of claim is Jesus making? That he's making some kind of claim for continuity with God's revelation in the Old Testament is clear enough. But can we be more specific? Let's look at some of the options. One possibility is that Jesus is thinking of his own behavior, his personal life of righteousness. Don't think that in my life I am going to ignore what the Old Testament says about the way I, as a Jew, need to live. No, I came with the purpose of doing all that the law commanded. This righteousness of our Lord's, obviously, is a theme we find elsewhere in Scripture. The teaching that, among other things, in order to establish a basis for salvation, Jesus himself personally fulfilled the law. He followed it to the letter. He did not stray from it, but in his own person was obedient to the Lord as no other human being ever had been. But the question must be raised about whether that interpretation fits this particular context. And it seems to fit awkwardly at best. First, note that Jesus goes on to talk not about his own personal observance of the law. He goes on throughout the rest of the chapter to talk about his teaching with respect to the law. Nothing is said about Jesus' own obedience in this context. The focus is entirely on the question, what is Jesus teaching? And how does his teaching relate to the Old Covenant revelation? A second possibility, particularly in light of the reference to the prophets in verse 17, is that Jesus here is claiming to be the one in whom Old Testament prophecies reach their fulfillment. Again, something that's obviously a theme of Matthew, one, as we have seen, that he hammers home again and again for us, but again, an idea that doesn't fit well into this particular context. For it seems clear that the so-called antitheses that we find in verses 21 through 48, these 6 places where Jesus juxtaposes what has been said to Jesus' own teaching. You have heard it said, but I say to you, this formula that we get in full or abbreviated form 6 times in verses 21 through 48, that this material is in a sense the example or the illustration or the application of the principle Jesus sets out in verse 17. I've come to fulfill the law and the prophets, and here is how I'm doing it. Let me give you some details. Let me show you how this is working out. More than that, it's important as we look at Jesus' teaching to remember that we have Jesus' teaching in Matthew's gospel. We can easily forget our job as interpreters of the Gospels at this point. we remember have no single word from Jesus directly. We do not have it. What we have are words of Jesus that have been filtered through inspired authors: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The point perhaps is an obvious one, but it's one we can forget, I think, in our interest to rightly defend the authenticity of the teaching of Jesus, that the teaching of Jesus that we have comes through the specific vocabulary and conceptual framework of these individual evangelists. And we have no access to Jesus' words apart from that filter. We might wish we had, but brothers and sisters, as far as I know, we don't. If there is a prophet among us, maybe we can hear about that later. One of my former colleagues at Trinity illustrated the point in this way. He tells a story on himself, which he claims is true, and he's a man of veracity, so I'll assume that it did take place. He tells of tape recording a television program one night, and realizing halfway during his taping of the program that he had been holding the microphone up to the mouth on the screen rather than to the speaker of the TV set. And he uses that to illustrate the problem that we might run into if we seek, as it were, to hold a microphone up to Jesus when we don't have access to Jesus. All that we know about Jesus in his teaching comes in, of course, the case we are looking at through Matthew, inspired by God to tell us what Jesus said and did. Now, let me come back to the text. You may wonder where all this is going. The point is this. We need then, when we are interpreting Matthew 5:17, to look carefully at the way Matthew himself uses this terminology elsewhere in his gospel. And when you do that, for instance, you will find that for Matthew, this phrase, the law and the prophets, is one he uses several times, and in each case, he uses it to capture the idea of the Old Testament demand, or law in a general sense, we might say. In other words, for Matthew, I think one can make the case that the phrase is not simply equivalent to the Old Testament or the entire canon, law, prophets, or as we have in a couple of places in the New Testament, law, prophets, and writings, the full threefold Jewish canon. No, in Matthew, it has the distinctive sense of what God demands of his people. You remember that as perhaps a kind of inclusio in the Sermon on the Mount, that is a device that kind of begins and ends on a similar note. We have the very well-known golden rule in Matthew 7:12. In everything, do to others what you would have them do to you, for this sums up the law and the prophets. You see the flavor of the phrase there? In acting this way toward others, Jesus says, we are fulfilling what it is God wants us to do as he has revealed it through the Old Testament. The phrase has a nuance of command or law. Bottom line, I think when Jesus talks about fulfilling the law and the prophets here then, he is specifically focused on how he, in his teaching, is filling up the Old Testament law. The phrase suggests that, the context points in that direction. Note also then that in verses 18 and 19, after Jesus makes this programmatic statement, he goes on and he talks not about prophets or his own behavior. Rather, he talks in verse 18 about the law and in verse 19 about commandments. All of these point, I think, clearly to the conclusion. What we have at this point in the Sermon on the Mount is an extremely significant assertion of our Lord about how we are to understand his teaching in relationship to the Old Testament law. Let's take our next step. If that is the case, what is that relationship? How are we to understand it? There have been three views popular in the history of interpretation when we ask that question. I'm sure there are many who have heard these, and probably many who have studied the matter and come to their own conclusions on this point. Forgive me if I'm carrying coals to Newcastle, as it were, and telling you what you already know. Nevertheless, quickly, three possibilities. One, a view deeply rooted, certainly in the Reformation tradition, is that Jesus is here claiming to exposit the law. I'm coming to fulfill it, Jesus is teaching, in the sense that I want to give the law its full measure of meaning. My intention, Jesus would be saying, is in a sense to restore God's law to its rightful interpretation, an interpretation that needs to be restored because so many of the Jewish rabbinic teachers of the time had taken away from its ultimate significance. And so these six antitheses are then often read as if Jesus is saying, here you are, you've heard this said, what you're being taught in the synagogue from your Jewish teachers is this, but let me tell you what the law really means. It is not what they say, what I say. I have come to fulfill the law and the prophets by filling them up to their intended significance as originally revealed by God. Before we evaluate these, let me look at two other possibilities. A second very popular option is the idea that Jesus is here radicalizing the law, or some would say deepening the law. He is filling it up in the sense that he is causing it to overflow. In the Old Testament, as God gave his law, the commandments had, as it were, this much meaning. Jesus is now filling up the glass by extending that meaning even further. Of course, this idea can be seen most readily in the first two antitheses. Well known, I think, to all of us. You've heard that it was said, don't murder. What, of course, does Jesus go on to say? Don't even be angry, I am telling you. People argue what Jesus is doing here is radicalizing God's demand by taking it from external behavior to interior attitude. The Old Testament law tells you not to murder. I'm telling you, take that even further to the root attitude, don't even be angry. Similarly, of course, the Old Testament says, don't commit adultery. Jesus says, fine, I have nothing against that. That's a good rule, but let's take it further. Don't even look at a woman in a lustful way. Let's get to the attitude, he says. So Jesus fulfills the law on this view by deepening or radicalizing its significance. Finally, third, and of course the right view, since I've listed it last, is that Jesus is proclaiming that in his teaching he brings the law to its intended climax in a way that cannot fit any of these models precisely. Jesus fulfills the law by, in his teaching, bringing God's will for his people to its climax. And the relationship between the Old Testament law and Jesus' teaching then is one both of continuity. There is a line we need to keep between them, Jesus insists, because what I am teaching, he says, is exactly what the Old Testament law has always pointed ahead toward. It's anticipated what I am now teaching. It is intended by God in salvation history to lead to what I now teach. So the line of continuity must be drawn. And of course, that's Jesus' point. I have come to fulfill the law and the prophets, not to abolish them. But at the same time, this view suggests there is discontinuity. There is discontinuity because the teaching of Jesus cannot simply be equated with the teaching of the Old Testament law. Jesus is not simply repeating what the Old Testament says. He is doing that, surely. But he's doing more than that. He is radicalizing it. He is going beyond it. He is changing it at places. There are all kinds of relationships that exist when we look at the details of Jesus' teaching and compare it to the Old Testament. Now, I would like to defend that third view a little bit with you, and I think the best place to go is to the antitheses and ask some hard questions about just what indeed is going on here. How indeed does Jesus practically, when he gets down to specifics, look at his teaching in relationship to the Old Testament law? What is the match? What is the relationship when we put them down side by side? Well, we've already mentioned the first two antitheses. In either of these, it could well be argued that Jesus is either expositing or deepening. And you look at the literature on the subject here, and you find some scholars who claim from the beginning in the Ten Commandments, God intended the prohibition of murder to include the prohibition of anger, the underlying attitude. And let's make it clear, by the way, in case I've given any kind of misunderstanding here, that the Old Testament itself is very clear about the need for a change of attitude, not just external behavior. Circumcision of the heart is Moses' idea, not a New Testament idea. So I want to make it clear that it is certainly false, as it were, to compare the Old Testament law and Christ's law and suggest, well, the Old Testament law is just looking at the externals of behavior, whereas Jesus is getting really to the heart. That's a caricature at best of the Old Testament laws, I think we all know. But the question still remains, when we take this specific commandment that God gave to Moses that said, do not murder, what does it mean? Not looking at other Old Testament teaching now, but at this commandment, how does Jesus fulfill that commandment? Does he simply give it its true original meaning? Or does he deepen or radicalize? And I would submit to you that there's little evidence that I can find in the Old Testament for the commandment, do not murder, to include the meaning, don't be angry. Many of us have been raised in a tradition where that assumption is so much a part of us that we probably have a hard time getting beyond it. But I would like to see the evidence that this commandment was interpreted that way. My point is not that the Old Testament might not prohibit anger. My point was that attached to this commandment? That I'm not so sure of. And I would say the same then for the very parallel second antithesis. Well, the third one, which I'm hesitant even to bring up, but briefly, the divorce issue. The Old Testament says anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. That's pretty straightforward out of Deuteronomy 24, as we all know. What does Jesus respond to that commandment? Does he simply say, yes, that's right, keep doing it? Exposition. Does he deepen it? Does he say, no, give her 2 certificates of divorce? Or when you give her the certificate, do it sincerely from your heart? You see how at this point these simple categories of exposition or radicalizing are beginning to blur a little bit around the edges. Now, to be sure, Jesus might simply be citing this commandment as a way of getting into the whole divorce remarriage controversy in first century Judaism. And we're well aware of some of the debates about the appropriate grounds for divorce and remarriage among the different Jewish teachers of the day, and Jesus attempting to come in and get things back to the heart of the matter, which has to do with God's original intention for the marriage relationship. But my point now, without getting into too much of that, is simply to say the category of exposition or deepening does not work real well with the actual commandment in relationship to Jesus' teaching here. Take the fourth antithesis. Jesus quotes from the Old Testament where it says, "Do not break your oath. Keep the oaths you have made to the Lord." 3 times we have essentially that said in the Old Testament law. How does Jesus respond? Don't take oaths at all. Now, this one is certainly trickier to pin down for 2 reasons. First, the context of these oaths in the Old Testament tends to be very narrow. It would not include some of the things we might consider oaths. Second, and more important, is the language Jesus goes on to use in the end of 34 and 35. Here one can make a very good case that Jesus is using this language because these were some of the terms already being used by Jewish teachers when they taught about oaths and which ones had to be kept and which ones could maybe be fudged a little bit. We have some evidence of rabbinic discussions along these lines using some of the same terms that Jesus uses here. In effect, if you swear by Jerusalem, you really need to keep that oath. But if you only swear by the temple, it doesn't have quite the same degree of significance. And so there's a gradation, as it were, in which one can effectively take oaths that skirt the truth. And of course, Jesus' concern is for absolute truthfulness. But again, does Jesus exposit that law? Does he radicalize it? Does he simply repeat what the Old Testament says? Well, maybe, but his "do not take oaths at all" does seem to be pretty broad and all-encompassing. At the least, we must say, exposition is not very clear here. Deepening, perhaps. How about retaliation? The fifth antithesis, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Again, 3 times in the Old Testament law, we find this language always applied to how the judges in Israel were to determine cases and verdicts. This was not a teaching that the individual Israelite was to use as an excuse for personal retaliation. That appears to be perhaps how it is being used. Once again, though, Jesus' teaching in response makes it difficult to discover what the relationship really is here. Don't resist an evil person, Jesus tells us. Well, we could spend a lot of time talking about what that means, or as the history of interpretation tends to suggest, what it does not mean. This is one of these verses where we spend most of our time squirming out of it, figuring out, no, it can't mean this, can't mean this, can't mean the other thing, rather than dealing with what Jesus really says here. Now, I am not myself in that Anabaptist Mennonite tradition, but I have people I teach with and good brothers who are, and I think they have an important function to perform in drawing our attention back to some of these texts that sometimes we too easily dismiss. We need to be so careful of accommodating the Lord's teaching to our culture, don't we? And saying, in effect, well, this is not practical politics, so clearly Jesus can't mean it. And taken as a hermeneutical device, this draws the teeth out of anything in the New Testament as we understand. But again, I think there are factors we need to bring in terms of explanation here. I think that we do need to carefully look at the context of the background of Jesus' day and some of the language he uses here. But when all is said and done once more, I don't think the categories of exposition or deepening fit this very well. Jesus seems to be saying, here is the Old Testament teaching which allowed this principle of retaliation, at least for the judges. I'm telling you as my followers, you are not to use that principle. Maybe that's what the Old Testament itself was teaching. But Jesus does not quote a commandment that makes that clear and simply says, I'm endorsing its meaning. He does something different than that. Well, finally, the sixth antithesis is, I think, the clearest case where we have Jesus responding not just to the Old Testament as such, but to Jewish interpretations of it. Love your neighbor and hate your enemy. As most of us know, the former part is good biblical teaching, Leviticus 19:18, but the latter is not. You do not find these words in the Old Testament. And despite the attempts of some people to think that passages like the imprecatory Psalms might be referred to here, I think in this case it is much more likely that Jesus is reflecting the way the Old Testament was being interpreted by many of his contemporaries. Love your neighbor was taken to give the excuse and hate your enemy. Love only your neighbor. And let's define that group, you see, as kind of the Jewish mentality here. And then that gives us the right to hate everybody else. Some indeed think that Jesus might be referring to the kind of teaching we find in the Dead Sea Scrolls, where you have some language of this sort. However that might be, I think it is important to understand that it's not as simple in these 6 antitheses as we might like it to be. It is not the case, on the one hand, that Jesus is simply quoting the Old Testament per se. To some extent, he is quoting it as it was being interpreted in the synagogues of his time. The last antithesis, I think, makes that clear. On the other hand, neither is it the case that in all of these antitheses, Jesus is citing misinterpretations from the synagogue of his day. Several of the quotations he makes from the law are quite straightforward, literal, fair renderings of what the law does teach. So the idea that what Jesus is doing is simply restoring the meaning of the law, option 1, I don't think does justice to the antitheses. The idea that he is deepening or radicalizing the law has some truth to it, but itself, again, does not explain all that's going on here. Rather, again, I would suggest, coming back then to the third option I've tried to argue, Matthew, quoting, of course, Jesus, is trying to help us understand that what Jesus is teaching is a teaching that has its own intrinsic authority, but it is a teaching that has definite and inseparable connections with the Old Testament law. We picture 2 boxes: Old Testament law, Jesus' teaching. The point Jesus is making here with the word fulfill, as I see it, is that we must draw a very clear and definite line from the one box to the other with an arrow. What God revealed to his people in his Old Testament law, all along anticipated, was leading toward, had inherent in it, a finalization of God's will for his people, which has now come in the teaching of Jesus. I have not come to abolish the law and the prophets. What I am doing, Jesus says, is part of what God's intention has been all along. Yes, Jesus, I think, says, I am claiming that I have the right as Messiah, the King of the kingdom being established, to dictate to my followers what they should and should not do. And in doing that, I do not need to base that on the Old Testament or any tradition. I can speak of my own authority as the King of the kingdom and establish the law for my followers. I think Jesus makes that claim, a claim that's recognized again at the end of the Sermon on the Mount. This guy teaches with authority, not like the scribes and the teachers of the law who said, I think you should do this because Rabbi Meir had it from Rabbi Elisha that. Jesus is direct in his approach in a way that startled the people of his day. At the end of the Gospel of Matthew, what do we have then? Jesus telling his disciples to do. They are to teach disciples to obey everything I have commanded you. not Moses, but everything I have commanded you. I'm not necessarily persuaded that in the Sermon on the Mount we are to see Mosaic allusions. Some see this. They think that we have, in Matthew's gospel especially, a presentation of Jesus as the new Moses, giving his law to his followers. Nor to me is it quite clear that Matthew has structured his gospel along the lines of the Pentateuch, with 5 separate teaching discourses of Jesus corresponding to the 5 books of the Pentateuch. These things might be implicit, but I'm not persuaded they are all that clear. But I think what we do have at this point in Matthew 5 is a claim on Matthew's part that Jesus is the one who now directly and immediately communicates the will of God for his people. That Jesus has, in that sense, taken on the role that Moses once had for the people of God. Again, before we misunderstand or take this too far, Matthew is equally concerned that we do not sever that relationship. And something that we want to explore a little bit more tonight, we will see that as this concept unfolds in the New Testament, we find that much of the Old Testament law is taken up into the teaching of Jesus and his apostles. Some final words on verses 18 and 19. What then did these verses mean if what I am suggesting to you is the significance of fulfill? Don't these verses suggest that what I've just been saying is really off base? Because doesn't Jesus here give a firm endorsement to the eternal validity of the commandments of the Old Testament? Let me just note a problem all of us have with that view. Maybe we haven't realized it. In Jesus' day, the words law and commandments, remember, would apply to the Jewish Torah in all of its parts. Indeed, for Jews in Jesus' day, the most important part of Torah was not what we might call the moral or ethical elements of the law. The most important part were the laws about sacrifice and cult and worship. So if we find here an endorsement of the eternal validity of the commandments of the law of Moses, we have a big problem with Hebrews, not to mention significant segments of other Old Testament passages. Why? Because there is no good reason, granted the Jewish context in which Jesus is teaching, to think he is talking only about what we might call the moral law here. It's a category essentially foreign to first century Judaism, one that has a slight basis in some verses here and there in the New Testament, but it's a distinction that, unless it is clear in a context, cannot be introduced because it is foreign to the mindset of the first century. With our long tradition of dividing the law up into moral, ceremonial, and civil law, these categories seem obvious to us, and we can implicitly give them biblical basis, when I'm not convinced they have that basis. So what I'm saying is that when we look at verses 18 and 19, any Christian has a problem with these verses. Indeed, as some of you will know, some of the redaction critics would suggest that we hear here the voice of a conservative Jewish Christian wing of the early church that Matthew is implicitly in the context rejecting. Now, I don't think we can go that direction, although why not would take a long time to explain. What might Jesus then be teaching? Well, first of all, I think verse 18 really does not present a great difficulty for us. What Jesus does here is to endorse the continuing revelational value of every single word of God's Old Covenant revelation. the revelatory value of every single word of God's Old Testament revelation. And surely, as Christians, we need to quickly endorse that as our attitude as well. Verse 18 is not saying that we will take all of the Old Testament language in a certain way. It is not saying that in order to appreciate the value and revelatory significance of the Old Testament, that we must assume a law God gave to the people of Israel has to be obeyed by us exactly the same way. It's simply saying that all has revelatory value. Verse 19 is more difficult, isn't it? Anyone who breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. Surely that suggests that the commandments of the Mosaic law must be taught to Christian disciples, and that obedience to even the least of those commandments is required of every one of us if we expect to find God's approval. That is certainly a plausible, superficial reading of the verse. Now, I've already suggested that all of us as Christians have difficulty, or should have difficulty with that. The question is, what are our alternatives? One possibility is this, that the word these in these commandments refers not back to the law of Moses, but forward to the teaching of Jesus. I like that alternative. I wish I could adopt it. But I don't find any place in Matthew where he uses the word these, its Greek equivalent, in that way. It always points back in Matthew. So I think it's a wonderful way out of our problem. But I don't see textual warrant for it. So I must confess that I don't have the kind of solution to this problem that I would like to have, neat, wrapped up in a package. I hope that you have progressed far enough in your understanding of Scripture to realize, as I'm sure you have, most of you are farther along in the process than I am, that we are not always going to wrap every exegetical detail up as neatly as we want. In this life, I'm firmly convinced there are always going to be those little bits sticking out that we've not quite got integrated as successfully as we would like to. And I hope you've become accustomed to admitting that to yourself and telling your people that very frankly. I think one of the disservices we can do in teaching our people is to suggest to them that, well, if you just look at things from my perspective, every single possible verse relating to it falls neatly into place. And implicitly then we're saying people who have a different view then are misinterpreting the Scripture so badly that it's doubtful whether we can give them any serious attention at all. I don't think we want to give that impression. But one thing I would suggest in verse 19, to come back to this then, is that I think we must understand all of what Jesus goes on to say in verses 18 and 19 as standing under the fulfill of 17. In other words, I would suggest it is not illegitimate to read verse 19 as saying, anyone who breaks one of the least of these commandments as I have fulfilled them. Yes, the law of Moses continues to be important for the people of God. The law of Moses as fulfilled by Jesus continues to be significant. But I would argue it is the as fulfilled by Jesus that is so important. Let me just conclude. I'm running over my time, although Fred ran over his, so this is the usual bumper car effect in these kind of conferences. Whether we will get to eat tonight at all or not remains to be seen. What I'm suggesting then, if I can try to wrap things up here in terms of what I understand Matthew to be teaching about the law here at least, is that in our traditional way of understanding matters, we have very often, and I find many Christians who hold this idea, they've been taught it from somewhere, that when Jesus came to fulfill the law, what happened sort of was this. You've got civil and ceremonial law that kind of come to an end in Jesus, and then he kind of interprets them. The moral law, though, seems to be something sort of going like this, that doesn't funnel through Jesus' fulfillment, that sort of just remains as it originally was given. And I would suggest to you that does not do justice to the all-encompassing claim that Matthew makes here. All the law funnels through Jesus. We cannot read the Old Testament law except reading it through Jesus. And we may disagree, and I'm sure we will, about just what Jesus' fulfillment might mean about this commandment or that commandment. That's fine. But it does seem to me we have to begin with the model of Jesus as the one who is the fulfiller of all of the law, and work from that perspective. Assume that and ask then the questions that need to be asked about how the Old Testament law does come through. Another way of putting it would be to say that many Christians think that we have a red letter edition of the Old Testament, in which the moral law is highlighted for us. And we assume that sort of just remains eternally intact without ever being touched by Jesus. But in fact, we don't have that, and hence the endless debates, for instance, about whether Sabbath is a moral or a ceremonial commandment. There it is in the Decalogue. And yet, and we wonder, where does it fit? And again, I would suggest that when we look at it from that direction, we are coming at it from the wrong way. We need to look at it from the direction of Jesus' fulfillment and draw our conclusions appropriately from that perspective. I've left a lot of issues uncovered, obviously, and I've spent most of my time on the law, but I really do want to draw us back to where I began, that the concept of fulfillment in Matthew is one that can stand as a kind of watchword over his way of looking at salvation history. And I think implicitly, as we will see later tonight, the New Testament way of looking at salvation history. The new stands in relationship to the old in a relationship of promise and fulfillment. Prophecies, history, law, it all comes to its rest and appointed end in Jesus. Let me finish with just one final verse, Matthew 11:13. Interesting language, again in Matthew on this point. Jesus talking about the significance of John the Baptist. All the prophets and the law prophesied until John. For Matthew, the law itself has a prophetic function and perspective.